So let me give you some working definitions of how I define sexual shame. So first, I want to define just shame. And so I like this definition, which describes shame as a sense of failure and excessive sensitivity, an inner wound from the critical evaluation of others. So that we as humans experience some negative, critical evaluation about some part of ourselves or our way of being, or our behaviors from others, and typically from others for whom we have a sense of esteem or we value their opinion or expectations of us. And that causes an internal sense of failure or feeling of less than, a feeling of wrongness, and an inner wound. So that's how I want to characterize shame. And then specifically today, we want to talk about sexual shame. And I define it as a sense of immorality or transgression about your sexual desires, fantasies, or behaviors based on the critical evaluation of others. And we're going to get into who those others are in just a little bit. So even though I'm talking about sexual shame, I want to acknowledge whenever you hear me talk about sex, I'm talking about the range, right, of our desires, fantasies, and behaviors, right? So we're thinking as expansively as possible, because many times our sources of sexual shame live within our expectations of what others have placed on us. And so they might not even, the sense of shame might not even be attached to any actual act or behavior, but just your awareness of what you have desired or fantasized about in a sexual way that is also attached to critical evaluation. One of the reasons why this topic of sexual shame is so critical for me are some of these outcomes that, while may not be directly attached to sexual shame, I think are indirectly significantly informed by sexual shame. And so one hallmark piece of data is that studies in different ways and shades when looking at sexual satisfaction or overall sexual pleasure when including women, find that overall women have less satisfactory sex lives than men. And again, keeping in mind that the research has still predominantly been with white heterosexual folks when we talk about gender from this lens, right? So this is more about sort of sex differences rather than an examination of gender, even though that work is exploding and expanding now. And a lot of the studies will either include sort of a comparison between or only look at one group. So depending on sort of the sample, you're going to find different specific outcomes. But generally speaking, there seems to be this pervasive pattern across the research that women and women-identified folks in samples are having less satisfactory sex lives, experience orgasm less consistently, particularly with male partners, and to a far lesser extent when they experience sex with same-gendered partner, and to an even lesser extent when experiencing self-pleasure and masturbation, right? So there's something happening in the experiences around who has access to and a right to sexual pleasure that is being distorted, I think, through a lens around gender and our socialization around access to that. And there's some other data that has looked at the differential experiences even around Black women and their experiences with masturbation. There's one notably far less very limited research about Black women and masturbation. And the data that does exist tends to also show this pattern, right? That there are these negative or at best mixed messages from family, caregivers, community, religion that sort of serve to shame sexual pleasure for women. So here's where I would like to spend a little bit of time is talking about sources of sexual shame. And so one of the primary ones, as you might imagine, comes from parents or caregivers. And then I would also say sort of followed closely by family. In my experience, in my previous life as an academic, and in my work with my clients, I hear a lot of voices from people's parents and caregivers that are still very present with them in their adult selves about who they are allowed to be as sexual beings and what is deemed as sexually acceptable. And so what I experience oftentimes is that folks have really gotten to a place in their adulthood where they're carrying around all of these unexamined sort of introjects, these ideas about what is acceptable sexually and what's not. And it's not necessarily that they're consciously aware of them or that those messages that they are carrying around are even congruent with their own values, but they cause stumbling blocks, they create limitations, they create negative impacts on their sexual lives in the current, I think oftentimes simply because they have gone unexamined. And I oftentimes think about it as sort of like you're carrying around these chunks of other people that really don't belong to you. And it's not until you're wanting to be more intimately connected that you realize like they're sort of getting in the way, but you haven't really examined them. And so parents and caregivers are a primary source. And what I hear, and I know is my experience as well, for Black women, that often looks like lots of negative messages around being nasty, or that certain sexual acts are just nasty, about there being a fear around pregnancy, there being a fear around disease contraction. So there is an overemphasis on all of these sort of negative outcomes of the act of intercourse, and very little, if any, counterbalance of conversation around the aspects of wellness, of opportunity for intimacy, just pleasure as a concept in and of itself with regard to sex. So I want to talk about all the ways that I see sexual shame showing up. And these are just some examples. And I wanted to sort of categorize them in these three ways, but in relationship to self, in relationship to your body, and in relationship with romantic or sexual partners. And so in relationship to self, that this can look like feeling unworthy of sexual pleasure, that the expectation that you can be empowered in defining and deciding what you want to receive or engage in to experience sexual pleasure may not be seen as acceptable or okay, is one of the primary ways that I see sexual shame show up. Also, having either really rigid or really porous sexual boundaries. So I can think of a client who had been spending time with a male friend, and then the male friend kissed her, and we talked about it in session, and I said, did you want to be kissed? Like, was that a transition in that relationship that you wanted to have happen? And her response was just, I'm not sure, right? There was a sense of like, I don't know what I want. He likes me. Obviously, he wanted me sexually, so I should be open as a sexual object, I guess, sort of, maybe, right? So not having the opportunity to really sort of be curious about your own self as a sexual being, or having really rigid boundaries around what is acceptable, sex being limited to intercourse between your primary partner or your husband and no one else, right? So it could look sort of both of those ways. Disconnection from pleasure, right? So that there can be a sense of sort of going through the motions or doing the sexual things, but not necessarily feeling pleasure from them, or not having a sense of awareness enough of what you want, need, or are curious about in terms of your sexual pleasure, to even be able to advocate for those things. So those are things that I see in relationship to self. And then in relationship to body, inability to orgasm or inability to orgasm consistently, inability or unwillingness to masturbate, ignorance of your body's pleasure map. So not knowing what parts of your body feels good, how the different parts of your body likes to be touched, what type of sensation feels good, what type of rhythm, pressure, all of those things, just being fully sort of not clear about what your body desires sexually, or overall avoidance of the body. So what do we do with all of this gross, colonized, disempowering, external shit? What do we do with it? And so this is why I live with the mantra, pleasure is a birthright. I think part of our sex negative culture is to, one, put sex in a box, and two, that somehow gets connected with our pleasure also being in a box. And in particular for Black women, so much of Black womanhood is about service to, production for, care of others. The very experience of asking women to center pleasure, to consider their pleasure, in and of itself is revolutionary. In and of itself is revolutionary. But if you flip that entire paradigm and not only require of the world for you to care for yourself, but to also center your pleasure in that caring, it leaves far less room for there to be shame. And so this is where I like to start in working with all of my clients. So I want to talk about the liberatory part now. I love this picture. I can't get enough of this picture. If I could get this picture tattooed on me, I would love it. So one, I just want to identify how I'm thinking about liberation and the liberatory practices. So one is freedom from externally imposed limits on thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. So that is what liberation is. Freedom from externally imposed limits on thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. And so when I talk about liberatory practices, I'm talking about things that intentionally revision, redefine, and revolutionize the status quo by centering healing, growth, and wholeness, right? So I'm going to talk about releasing sexual shame in 3 different ways. One is getting at the root. And so for me, this is fundamentally recognizing that all Black women, femmes, non-binary folks are worthy of sexual pleasure, liberation, curiosity, exploration, play, and even uncertainty. That even in your uncertainty about what you want, desire, need as a sexual being is yours, and you are worthy of that in figuring it out. That does not have to be shameful if you are unclear, but it is a part of your process of honoring your sexuality and your right to pleasure. And so then for me, the practice looks like reorienting to the body, identifying which narratives are theirs versus which are others, working to amplify their voices, and most importantly, increasing self-compassion. There is not a Black woman that I have worked with or that I know as a Black woman that doesn't have superhuman expectations of themselves to be all things to all people at all times. And this idea of just being human, somebody that is unsure, that is fallible, that is tired, that makes mistakes, and that it still allows you to be worthy and beautiful and wonderful and amazing, is fundamental work that I do over and 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 over again with my work with Black women.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nikki, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I am a licensed psychologist, a racial equity trainer and consultant, and a sex self-confidence coach. I'm also the owner and operator of Dr. Nikki Knows, where I focus on centering joy and pleasure in the mental wellness of Black folks. Thank you so much for visiting my channel.